Welcome to the second in our 2009-2010 St. Jerome's Lecture Series in Catholic Experience. My name is Dr. Joanne Badham-Rennick, and I'm your host for the remainder of this series, which is actually technically I'm only your host for tonight, because as of January, Scott Klein will return and he will take over, resume his responsibilities as the director. But it's my pleasure to be with you tonight, and my apologies for not being with you last time. We've had a somewhat inauspicious start to the series. Our first speaker was ill, as you heard, and our second speaker arrived, not safe and sound, but I was ill, and now we're here. So it's all good, and we'll carry on as we need to. I had an interesting phone call from one of you who remarked that the lights in the hall were too low last time, and her husband had to keep nudging her awake. So they're a little higher tonight. I hope that's good. We have a very interesting speaker, so I don't think it'll be a problem either way, even if we really drop the lights. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I have a few brief announcements for you. First of all, I just want to remind you that our Beyond Borders students are here with us again this week. You've seen them already in the hallway there. Our Beyond Borders program is an international service learning program here at St. Jerome's University. This is a program that allows our students across campus in different faculties and different disciplines to use their abilities and their skills and their training that they're getting here at the university in meaningful ways in the developing world. They take 2 courses and then they spend a summer abroad for 3 months. They work in every kind of different environment. Sometimes they work in a HIV/AIDS clinic. Sometimes they work, with people with mental or physical handicaps. They teach English. They work with youth. They help in microfinancing programs. They do women's empowerment. They do every kind of different thing. And it's a life-changing experience for them. The program is designed to work alongside the UN Millennium Development Goals. So they address their energies towards those kinds of efforts. And I know that many of you here are very interested in those things, and you've been very helpful to us in the past through your support, both financial and emotional, to our students. They're there tonight selling items to help fundraise for the program that will take them abroad. So while a lot of other young people will be spending next summer hanging out on the beach and drinking beer and partying, our students will actually be hanging out in the slums and working very hard. And it's a very amazing experience. So if you can find a way to support them with the various things that they're selling there, they have wonderfully made, home-designed by one of our students, 100% ethically sourced Canadian-made T-shirts. Beyond Borders logo on the front, and then the word learn in a variety of languages on the back. And they're really good shirts. They're also selling some gift cards for local retailers. There's no additional cost to you, so if you buy a $20 gift card for Chapters, you get $20, but they get a cut of that from Chapters. So if you're looking to do some shopping for Christmas, that would be a great way to do it and also support a good cause. The third thing that they've got going is a dinner and silent auction that's happening next Friday. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the program or see some of the photographs of where they've been or hear some of their stories, then we would urge you to come out and join us. It should be a very lovely evening, a nice meal. It's over at the University Club, which is beside the athletics building on main campus, and they have information there. So we'd love to see you, and it would be a very nice evening. And if you have a wayward teenager that you're wanting to focus, then please bring them. Now that I'll get off my soapbox here with my sales pitch, and I will turn you to the main event of the evening. We have with us Dr. Will Kymlicka of Queen's University. Dr. Kymlicka was born and raised in Canada. He was educated at Queen's and Oxford University and has held positions at various Canadian, American, and European universities before moving to Queen's University, where he is the Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy in the Philosophy Department. He has taught there since 1998. He's also a recurrent visiting professor in the Nationalism Studies program at the Central European University in Budapest. Dr. Kymlicka has authored over 200 articles and 8 books, including Multicultural Citizenship, 1995, which was awarded the Macpherson Prize by the Canadian Political Science Association, and the Bunche Award by the American Political Science Association. And most recently, Multicultural Odysseys, Navigating the New International Politics of Diversity in 2007. He's also the editor, a co-editor of numerous other books. He's a fellow of the Roay Society of Canada and of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. From 2004 to 2006, he was president of the American Society for Political and Legal Philosophy. His works have been translated into 32 languages, and most recently, he was the recipient of the 2009 Premier's Discovery Award in the Social Sciences, and it is our great pleasure to have him here with us this evening. Please welcome Dr. Kymlicka.
Thank you, Joanne, for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to come here tonight. I'm delighted to be with you. I basically want to give you a kind of update on our 40-year experiment in Canada in multiculturalism. I think everyone agrees on the importance of this experiment to our future as a country. We are committed to a high level of immigration, where our success as a country depends on managing ethnic diversity in a successful way, but people disagree about how well that experiment is going and what sorts of changes, if any, are needed in it. In some ways, this is so I basically want to kind of review the current debate around multiculturalism. In some ways, the debate today is not all that different from what it was 30 or 40 years ago. The same arguments tend to get repeated over and over again. People who support multiculturalism argue that it helps to create a more welcoming society for various groups. It helps to reduce barriers to participation and thereby assists in integration and social cohesion. Those who are against multiculturalism tend to argue that it encourages groups to look inward rather than to participate in the larger society, and that it exaggerates the differences between us rather than emphasizing what we share in common. Those arguments have been around since the idea of multiculturalism was floated in the late 1960s. And in many ways, not much has changed in terms of, it's a very ritualized debate. If you read newspaper columnists or talk show radio, it tends to be the same arguments over and over again, year after year. But one thing that has changed, I think, since the policy was adopted in 1971 is the larger world has changed. We live in a very different global context. And one example of that is that for much of the 70s, 80s, and even into the 1990s, Canada was a kind of international champion of multiculturalism. Canada was kind of in the business of exporting multiculturalism to other countries. We were, if you like, exporting optimism about the possibility of a multicultural society with a certain amount of success. Canada, the Canadian message was listened to in some other countries. But in the last 10 years or so, I would say, the rest of the world has, in a quite dramatic way, turned its back on multiculturalism. We see a fairly striking trend towards retreat from and backlash against multiculturalism, particularly in Western Europe, but not just there. And that growing global pessimism about multiculturalism is now being imported into Canada. So we've kind of gone from exporting multicultural optimism to importing multicultural pessimism. And I think, in a way, both of these were probably unhelpful. I don't necessarily think that it was a good idea to be trying to persuade all the other countries of the world to adopt the Canadian model, but equally, I don't think we should be unduly influenced by the growing pessimism in other countries. I think we should look at the Canadian experience in its own terms rather than reading our experience through the lens of other countries. Anyway, so what I want to do is just go through some recent evidence about how we're doing on ethnic relations generally and multiculturalism in particular, and then try to explain how that relates to these kind of global anxieties about multiculturalism and what this may entail for our future. Okay, so firstly, just what do I mean by multiculturalism? So it's important to emphasize that multiculturalism is not the only tool in the toolkit in terms of managing diversity in Canada. I like to think of it as we have our approach to diversity is kind of a three-legged stool. We have one leg concerns Aboriginal peoples. A second leg concerns the French fact, bilingualism in Quebec. And then a third leg concerns multiculturalism, which is primarily adopted not in relation to Aboriginal peoples, not in relation to the French fact, but in relation to all of the other groups that have come to become part of Canadian society from all around the world. These are, as you could think of it as three legs of a stool. You could also think of them as three silos. These are very different types of policies. They are addressed in different sections of the Canadian Constitution. We have a multiculturalism clause. We have 2 clauses on Aboriginal peoples. We have several clauses relating to bilingualism and federalism. So they have different constitutional definitions. They're administered by different government departments. They're governed by different pieces of legislation. So we have these 3 quite different legs of our diversity model in Canada. And so I'm going to focus on the multicultural part of it. There's a lot to be said on the Aboriginal side and on Quebec, and I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer period. But I'm going to be primarily focusing on the multiculturalism policy. So in relation to these, so it's often said that multiculturalism concerns the ethnic groups in Canada as distinct from Aboriginal peoples or French Canadians. So historically, the Canadian approach to the integration of newcomers was an assimilationist approach, what sociologists call the Anglo-conformity model. It was expected that immigrants, when they come to Canada, should essentially become, over time, indistinguishable from the kind of core British society that founded Canada, and that they should become indistinguishable in their tastes, in their appearance, in the way they talked, and that those groups that were seen as incapable of this kind of Anglo-conformity were essentially kept out of the country. So as you probably all know, until the mid-1960s, we had racially discriminatory immigration policies that made it very difficult for non-Europeans to come to Canada because they were seen as incapable of achieving this Anglo-conformity assimilation. But since the mid-1960s, we've adopted this new experiment in diversity in the way we think about newcomers who come to Canada. On the one hand, we've accepted that it's natural and normal for newcomers to want to remain distinctive in their identities and cultural practices, that people shouldn't be ashamed of their ethnic origins, they shouldn't have to hide their ethnic origins when they participate in public life, and that it's normal and appropriate for people to want to participate as Greek Canadians, as Vietnamese Canadians, and to do so visibly and proudly, and that public institutions should have some duty to accommodate ethnocultural diversity so as to make it possible for people to participate without having to hide or deny their ethnic origins. So that's part of it. We've accepted a kind of duty of multicultural accommodation, and relatedly, we've eliminated the racial discrimination in the immigration policy, such that today the vast majority of our immigrants come from outside of Europe. Okay, so that's basically what I mean by the multicultural experiment, the opening up of immigration to people from all over the world, and the acceptance of the legitimacy of the maintenance of ethnic identities and the duty of public institutions to accommodate that, to honor and accommodate it. Okay, that's if you like the broad meaning of multiculturalism. It is institutionalized in a very specific way in the multiculturalism program in the federal government, which provides funding for a variety of activities. It's also recognized. We have a Multiculturalism Act of 1988 that requires all federal government departments and agencies to take multiculturalism into account in their activities. So the specific multiculturalism program is housed in citizenship and immigration in one department, but under the Multiculturalism Act, all departments, Agricultural Canada and the CRTC and all federal government agencies and departments are required to take into account this norm or value of multiculturalism. And at the very highest level, Section 27 of the Constitution says that the Constitution shall be interpreted in a way that acknowledges the multicultural heritage of Canada. Okay, so that's what I mean by multiculturalism. So the question is, how is this experiment going? Multiculturalism was first adopted, the government program was first adopted in 1971, so we have roughly 38 years of experience with this experiment. And I think there's now time to step back and ask, is it going well? So I want to briefly discuss some actually quite recent evidence about how Canada is doing, both in terms of the success of our immigrant integration policies, and more specifically, the role that multiculturalism plays in that record. So on the first question, how are we doing in terms of the integration of immigrants in Canada? Now that we've abandoned the Anglo-conformity model and acknowledged the legitimacy of ethnic identities, how has that affected the immigrant integration in Canada? So there's actually been some quite reassuring news from comparative studies that try to compare Canada with other Western democracies. We can think about integration, to simplify, as having a political, an economic, and a social component. So, and on each of these, there's been some interesting recent findings. So in terms of political integration, immigrants are more likely to take out citizenship in Canada than in other Western democracies. And they don't just take out citizenship in order to make sure they can get back to Canada when they travel abroad. It's not just a passport. That when they take out citizenship, immigrants are also more likely to vote in Canada than naturalized immigrants in other countries. They're more likely to run for political office. And when they do run for political office, they're more likely to be elected. That's to say that in Canada, compared to other Western democracies, minority candidates are not subject to an ethnic penalty. It turns out, so far as we can tell, that Canadians are just as likely to vote for visible minority candidates or foreign-born candidates as they are for white candidates or native-born candidates. That's quite unusual in a comparative perspective. In terms of economic integration, you can think our goal here is something like equality of opportunity for immigrants and their children. And economic equality of opportunity could be broken down into two parts. Firstly, the opportunity to acquire skills, and secondly, the ability to translate those skills into appropriate jobs. And on both of those scores, again, Canada appears to be doing reasonably well. In terms of acquiring skills, the OECD did a huge international comparison about the educational attainment of the children of immigrants. And the children of immigrants in Canada do better than the children of immigrants in any other Western democracy. And that's not just because we recruit skilled immigrants. That's true even if you hold the skill level of the parents constant. So the children of less educated immigrants do better in Canada than the children of less educated immigrants in other Western democracies. In fact, actually, the children of immigrants do better than the children of native-born Canadians. And Canada is unique in that, according to the OECD study. And then in terms of, the children of immigrants are acquiring skills. They're doing actually very well in schools, generally speaking. Are they able to then turn those into jobs? So there was a recent study done by the British Academy of what they call the ethnic penalty in the labor market. So assuming people have a certain set of skills, to what extent are members of visible minorities or ethnic minority communities, do they face a penalty in getting jobs that are commensurate with their skills? Now, in every Western democracy, there is such an ethnic penalty that whites tend to have an easier time translating their skills into commensurate employment. But the size of the ethnic penalty is smaller in Canada than in any other Western democracy. So at least on those, acquiring skills and translating skills into commensurate jobs, Canada seems to be doing reasonably well. And then if we think about social integration, if we think about issues of support for immigration, Canada is by far and away, the public opinion in Canada compared to any other Western democracy is much more supportive of high levels of immigration. In most countries, most Western countries, there's a clear majority that wants to reduce the number of immigrants, and a clear majority that views immigration as in some ways harmful to the country. Whereas in Canada we have, again, on a comparative scale, much higher levels of support for ongoing high levels of immigration, which is reflected in the virtual total absence of anti-immigrant parties in Canada, which are widely found in most other Western democracies. So there's a reasonable level of social acceptance of the fact of immigration, high levels of immigration, and the fact that we're building a diverse society through our own decisions to admit large numbers of immigrants from all around the world. But also, and this again is unique to Canada, there is a positive correlation between the strength of national identity in Canada and support for immigration. That's to say, those who are more proud of being Canadian or more strongly identify with Canada are more likely to support immigration. Canada is the only country where that's true. In every other Western democracy, those who are most patriotic are anti-immigrant. And it's only in Canada that those who are proud and patriotic Canadians are also supportive of immigration, which I think is an interesting finding, which is evidence of the kind of social acceptance of diversity. Okay, so that's some of the good news, but that doesn't yet tell us what role, if anything, multiculturalism plays. As I said, I mean multiculturalism in particular, and as I said, at least part of the success of the Canadian story is due to the fact that we simply cherry pick immigrants. We select highly skilled. We try as best we can to get the best and the brightest from the rest of the world, and so that compared with other Western democracies, our immigrants are not generally speaking uneducated or unskilled. They bring with them high levels of human capital or social capital, if you like. And so it's not surprising in a way that they find it easier to integrate, to participate in society. They come with more resources to begin with. And so it's not surprising that they are able to participate more and more interested in participating, and also that Canadians are more accepting. So for example, it's one of the statistics shows one of the survey questions that's asked around the Western democracies is whether you think immigrants increase the crime rate. So in most countries, clear majorities believe that immigrants are responsible for increasing the crime rate, which is most Canadians don't say that. Actually, a very small number of Canadians express that view. But in a way, that's not surprising. You wouldn't expect a highly skilled engineer coming from India to be involved in criminal activity, or a Chinese entrepreneur. Whereas it's more understandable that someone living in France, say, who perceives most immigrants as being essentially unskilled manual laborers from North Africa who are now often unemployed, it's not surprising that there might be a perception that they're more likely to be involved in criminal activity. So I think it's clear that part of what's going on in the Canadian, part of what's involved in explaining Canada's comparative record is simply the selection of immigrants rather than what happens once they get here. That because we recruit and select more highly skilled immigrants, that explains part of the relative success in terms of economic, political, and social integration. But it doesn't explain all of it. And I actually think that here, too, there's been some interesting evidence that suggests that multiculturalism in particular has played an important and constructive role in enabling the integration of immigrants. And that's true for all three of these dimensions, political, economic, and social. So on the political front, why is it that immigrants in Canada are more likely to participate politically than immigrants in other countries, more likely to get involved in political parties, more likely to run for office, and so on? Irene Bloomrad, who's a sociologist at Berkeley, did a very interesting study comparing the Vietnamese community in Boston and Toronto. And one of the reasons why this is a very interesting comparison is it's virtually random whether the Vietnamese refugees ended up in Boston and Toronto. They're virtually identical on any demographic characteristic, their skill levels, their English language skills, the amount of money they brought with them, their family size. I mean, it's almost as if nature just randomly distributed them to Toronto and Boston. They're much more active politically in Toronto. Why is that? So Bloomrad engaged in extensive interviews and studies. She argues that it's the multiculturalism policy, that in the United States, immigrants are given no encouragement to participate. They're given no encouragement to organize, whereas the multiculturalism policy provides, as it were, moral encouragement and also financial assistance for ethnic groups to self-organize. It helps to create a cadre of people who are competent to participate in their new country of residence, and it creates mechanisms of participation and consultation with the larger society. And that the Vietnamese in Toronto feel that they have been asked to participate. They feel that they've got a message that says you are welcome to participate, whereas the Vietnamese in Boston apparently do not feel that they received that message. She also parenthetically compared the Portuguese in Toronto and Boston and found the exact same finding. In terms of economic integration, why is it that children of immigrants are achieving better in Canadian schools than in other Western schools? Well, it's not because we have better public schools. We all know our public schools are kind of mediocre on in comparison with many other Western democracies. According to the OECD, the reason why the children of immigrants do better is because the Canadian public schools have gone through a rigorous and sustained process of adapting themselves to a growing immigrant population, what we could call a kind of multicultural preparedness. It's part of the mandate of public schools, and this follows from our multiculturalism policy, that they adopt a proactive duty to ask, are our schools set up to be accommodating of the new groups that are coming into our society? And that proactive multicultural preparedness is not found to the same extent in other Western democracies. And on the social integration, I really do think this finding that there's a correlation between national identity and support for immigration in Canada is very interesting. I mean, or to put it the other way, it's striking that in every other country, those who are most patriotic are more fearful of immigrants. And in a way, that's what you might expect, that those people who are proudest of their country are going to be most fearful about newcomers who are going to change society. So why is it that Canada's been able to break that pattern and be able to create people who are proud of their country but also welcoming of newcomers? And the answer is because we've made the idea of diversity part of what it is, a part of our country. That when newcomers come, yes, they're going to bring some changes, but diversity is not a foreign value to Canadian society. It's part of who we are. It's part of what makes us Canadian. And so that, in other words, ideas of ethnic diversity are part of our national identity. And so one can be very proud of that national identity and simultaneously be supportive of immigration. Lots of other countries have tried to construct a national identity that's inclusive of diversity. Probably most Western democracies have. You can find a public document that says we're constructing more open and inclusive national identities. But at least based on this evidence, it's only in Canada that we've been able to construct a national identity that people can feel proud of and strongly identify and simultaneously be supportive of immigration. Okay, so I could go on. There's other studies we could talk about, but I think there really is growing evidence from the last few years, both that Canada has a strong comparative advantage in the integration of immigrants and that multiculturalism has played a role in that relative success story. Okay, I'm guessing that some of you may not have heard this success story because it's not what we hear about in the media. What the media tends to talk about is instead a much gloomier story about fears of failure and backlash. And I think the explanation for that is, as I said, that we live in a world where multiculturalism is faring quite badly. That in much of the rest of the world, there is a backlash against multiculturalism. There is a perception of its failure. As I said, this is very strong in Western Europe, and it's said to be responsible for a number of social ills. So if those of you who are familiar with the European debate will recognize this, multiculturalism in Europe is said to be responsible for high levels of ethnic segregation. for the creation of parallel societies. This is a term that's used in virtually every Western democracy. That immigrants form parallel societies that are segregated from the larger society and therefore socially isolated. And that one result of this segregation is that there's polarization between groups, distrust between groups, and increased stereotyping and prejudice between groups. And that at the hard edge, this leads to radicalization, such as homegrown terrorism, or the perpetuation of illiberal practices amongst certain immigrant groups, like honor killings or forced arranged marriages. So in many Western European countries, multiculturalism is blamed for all of these things. Social segregation between ethnic groups, ethnic polarization and distrust, radicalism and illiberal practices. And to put it in a nutshell, to use the words of Trevor Phillips, who's the head of the Commission for Racial Equality in Britain, he said that that as a result of multiculturalism, Britain is sleepwalking into segregation. This is a term that has been repeated over and over again in Europe. As a result of multiculturalism, Britain is sleepwalking into segregation. And that idea is not just Trevor Phillips. As I say, it's been picked up and invoked by many other politicians, and not just on the right, not just amongst conservative, xenophobic, populist, anti-immigrant politicians. Trevor Phillips, by the way, is Labour. But it's now the consensus across the political spectrum in Europe. Right-wing and left-wing and centrist parties are all persuaded of the view that multiculturalism is causing us to sleepwalk into segregation. And just one other example of this. Last year, the Council of Ministers of, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, so the main executive body of the Council of Europe, issued a report in which it said that multiculturalism has proven to be the flip side of assimilation. Each is equally the cause of mutual incomprehension and distrust. So that just as assimilation failed, so in a reverse way, multiculturalism has failed. They're both different ways of creating polarization between groups rather than cohesive society or mutual understanding. So that's, as I say, that's the executive of the Council of Europe. That reflects the consensus of all the member states. So Europe has kind of come to this consensus that in their view, they all agree that multiculturalism has failed and is responsible for these social evils. And so that's what's happening in Europe. But I think that very powerful development, that very powerful backlash against multiculturalism in Europe is having after effects, aftershocks, as it were, here in Canada. That what we see is a growing number of commentators, particularly on the right, although not exclusively, who are looking at what happened in Europe and saying, okay, that's what happens when you go down the multicultural road. So a perfect example of this, I don't know how many of you saw it, Alan Gregg wrote an article in The Walrus a couple years ago. It's a classic formula. He starts with the riots in the banlieue in Paris and says, Europe is faced with this ethnic polarization. Why? Because of multiculturalism, and that's what we're walking into. And that we are sleepwalking into it. We may think we're immune, but that's just because multiculturalism has lulled us into a sense of false complacency, that if we just opened our eyes, we'd see that we are following the same path as European countries, sleepwalking into segregation. Richard Gwynne has made that argument, Jack Granatstein, Margaret Wente, the usual, all these people. So they all have the exact same formula. Whether it's the riots outside Paris or whether it's the murder of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, they all start with some crisis in Europe around ethnic polarization, and then say it's going to happen here if we don't wake up, if we don't open our eyes to the warning signs of the impending crisis that multiculturalism is leading us into. That multiculturalism has lulled us into the sleepwalk, but if we opened our eyes, we would see the warning signs. And so on this view, Europe serves as a kind of warning sign, a kind of canary in the mine or something, that we should look to Europe as a warning sign, and that once because it shows us where multiculturalism takes us, and so then they ask, well, then they're looking around to see what are the signs of the writing on the wall in Canada, right? So they're committed to the view that we must be following the European path to crisis and polarization, that we too are sleepwalking into segregation. That's their argument. So then the question is, what's the evidence that in the Canadian case we too are sleepwalking into segregation? And so, and this is, so we've seen a variety of efforts by these commentators to try to persuade Canadians that if we opened our eyes, we would be able to see the evidence that we're sleepwalking into segregation. Okay, so what's the evidence that these commentators point to for this impending ethnic polarization in Canada? So there's a variety of possible bits of evidence that people point to, and I couldn't possibly go through them all, but let me just mention a couple and explain why I think they're misleading and unhelpful. So one of them is the issue of ethnic enclaves. I don't know how many of you noticed in the Globe last year, Statistics Canada, every once in a while reports on how many ethnic enclaves exist in Canada. The term ethnic enclaves is a statistical artifact that Stats Canada creates based on whether, within a particular census tract, what's the percentage of visible minorities. And what they've shown is that over the past 10 or 15 years, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of census tracts that meet this statistical definition of an ethnic enclave. There's over 300 of them now, according to StatsCan in Canada. And in the media, now StatsCan doesn't say this is good or bad. It doesn't. It's just reporting how many census tracts pass a certain definition of having a percentage visible minority. But the media reported this as ghettos. We've got the growing problem of ghettos in Canada. And I think this is just a complete fabrication. It's a complete misunderstanding. The StatsCan definition of ethnic enclaves, I mean, the term ghettos implies what people are worried about in Europe, social isolation, like the banlieue in Paris, where these immigrant neighborhoods are completely cut off, often by massive highways from the larger city, and also poverty and a lack of intergenerational mobility. These are the classic definitions, sociological definitions of a ghetto: social isolation, poverty, and a lack of mobility. When people ask how many of these ethnic enclaves in Canada meet that test, none, zero of the ethnic enclaves in Canada met the sociological test of being a ghetto. It doesn't mean we don't have poverty in Canada, and it doesn't mean that immigrants are not disproportionately poor, but we do not. This issue of ethnic enclaves is as I say, it's a statistical fabrication that's disconnected from any. In fact, if you ask which immigrant groups in Canada are doing worst, it's those that are least likely to live in ethnic enclaves. The groups that do worst in Canada are blacks from the Caribbean and Latin Americans, and they have the lowest level of ethnic concentration. The groups that have the highest level are the Chinese and, in earlier generations, the Jews, who've been doing very well. There's absolutely no correlation in Canada between levels of ethnic concentration and how well you're doing in terms of education, employment, or intergenerational mobility. So I just think this was a whole media fabrication. I mean, I blame StatsCan in part for creating this. I think it's a meaningless statistic, but the media also for trying to link this. There was absolutely no justification for linking this StatsCan statistic about the number of ethnic enclaves with the issues of banlieue in Paris. It was a complete, I think it was kind of irresponsible journalism. A second piece of evidence that people point to is the Quebec reasonable accommodation debate, which is actually, in a very interesting way, a kind of echo of what's happening in Europe. So if people are looking to see, what in Canada looks like it's mimicking what's happening in Europe, What happened in Quebec 2 years ago around the reasonable accommodation debate actually is a kind of an echo of the European debate. So it was a kind of moral crisis, a moral panic. That what happened is that partly again as a result of irresponsible media journalism, a series of anecdotes about allegedly unreasonable demands made by Orthodox Jews or by Muslims were blown out of proportion to create a sense of crisis in Quebec society. And then the ADQ, a political party, started to run on an anti-immigrant platform, saying we need to protect Quebec society from the corrosive effect of all of these aggressive minorities, and started to win votes. And was doing quite well in the polls and gained quite a bit in that provincial election. And that's exactly the dynamic, and it was putting a lot of pressure on the Liberal government in Quebec to pass laws that were anti-immigrant, to reduce the number of immigrants, to demand a more assimilationist approach to immigration. And that's exactly the dynamic that we saw in many European countries, that there'd be some particular outrage that then got picked up and turned into a media frenzy, that a political party then would run on an anti-immigrant platform, would gain votes, and that in that moment of crisis, governments would adopt some quite illiberal law, a backlash and retreat from multiculturalism. What happened in the Quebec case, though, was quite interesting, that we didn't get the backlash and the retreat. What we got was that, confronted with this moral panic, the Liberal government called a commission, the Taylor-Bouchard Commission, which conducted a series of research reports. It conducted public hearings and it conducted research, and it showed, and they said this on the very first page of their report, there is no crisis in Quebec in ethnic relations. That if you look at all the statistics, and including the kinds of statistics I mentioned earlier, that in terms of the general levels of social acceptance of diversity, in terms of issues of ethnic friendships, in terms of people, in terms of issues of isolation and segregation and so on, that the basic trends with respect to ethnic relations in Quebec were going well, and that the basic mechanisms in place to deal with the issues of religious accommodation were working well. And so the Taylor-Bouchard Commission concluded that there was no justification for a U-turn in Quebec's multiculturalism policies. In Quebec, as you may know, they call it interculturalism rather than multiculturalism for interesting and complicated political reasons. But the point is that the Taylor-Bouchard Commission very firmly said there is no evidence that would justify a retreat or backlash from the current policy of accommodation, or a retreat or backlash from the continuing policy of recruiting high levels of immigration, and that's what we have. That's what we have in Quebec. There has been no the government has not. Basically, the government rode out the moral panic. The moral panic has now subsided. The report said there's no crisis, and so it's basically the same policies that were in place before this whole crisis emerged. Let me mention one other kind of bit of evidence that some people point to for the claim that we're sleepwalking into segregation. There was a study done of the second-generation visible minorities, so Canadian-born children of visible minority parents, which showed that, Jeff Wrights at the University of Toronto did this study, that the second generation have lower levels of belonging. They express lower levels of belonging to Canada than their parents. So that's interesting and worrisome. So the parents who come from other parts of the world express high levels of a sense of belonging to Canada, but their children, even though they're born and raised in Canada, have a lower level of belonging. And again, this was picked up in the media and reported as evidence of ethnic polarization, social segregation, blah, 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 blah. A variety of newspapers kind of engaged in this prolonged discussion about the fate of the second generation in Canada, particularly of second generation visible minorities. Okay, so it's a disturbing finding, and I don't want to whitewash it. But it just let me just mention a couple of qualifications. Why again, I think it's completely misleading to read this in light of segregation and polarization. The second generation visible minorities in the same study, although they express lower levels of belonging, we're talking about the difference between, so the parents, you're asked how strongly do you feel you belong, what's the strength of your sense of belonging to Canada on a scale of 1 to 10? This is the way social scientists often ask these questions, to rank something on a scale of 1 to 10. And so for the parents, it's 8.8 out of 10, and for the children, it's 8.5. Well, it's disturbing that it goes down, but it's not exactly radicalization and polarization and segregation. It's also worth noting that on the question of whether you're proud of Canada, the second generation is as high, not only as the first generation, it's as high as native-born white Canadians. That there's no difference in the levels of pride in Canada between second-generation visible minorities and any other Canadian. It's only on the belonging question. It's interesting. Why would people who very strongly feel proud of Canada don't feel as strongly that they belong to it? And there are interesting things to explore there. But again, given that what remains very high levels of belonging and given the even higher levels of pride, I don't think this is evidence of sleepwalking into segregation. Okay, I could talk about, Granitstein and Gregg and Fulford and et al. Have other little bits of evidence that we could talk about, I could come back to. But I really do think that if we look at these, they actually, they're often overblown, they're being reported irresponsibly, and that we just do not have evidence for sleepwalking into segregation in Canada. We don't have evidence of growing ethnic polarization. Quite the contrary, I think. Okay. So what follows from all that? I don't want to imply that we should be complacent, that we've achieved utopia. I actually think we have lots of problems in Canada. I just think, including problems around multiculturalism, I just don't think our problems are the same problems as what Europe is facing at the moment. So let me conclude by briefly mentioning what I think are some real problems that we need to talk about, but which I think in a way have been lost because of this unhelpful influence of reading Canada through the European lens. So, so let me mention three issues that I think we really need to think seriously about. One is about the role of religion in multiculturalism. That it's one of the idiosyncrasies of Canadian multiculturalism that the policy was first demanded by predominantly European origin, white, Christian ethnic groups. That the original groups that mobilized for multiculturalism were, above all, the Ukrainians, but also the Italians, the Poles, Germans. If you go back and look at the records for, who came up with the idea of multiculturalism as a public policy in Canada, it emerged in the late 1960s in the context of the B&B Commission, and it was overwhelmingly these often long-settled white ethnic groups who forcefully appeared before the B&B Commission and said, if you're going to adopt bilingualism, which was the main mandate of the B&B Commission to articulate a bilingual vision of Canada, these groups said, well, it should be bilingual and multicultural, that we're willing to accept a bilingual definition of Canada that affirms the status of French, but we don't want to be rendered invisible. We want to make sure that our legitimacy is recognized as well, not by giving official language status to Ukrainian and Italian. We realize that there's going to have to be some, that French and English will be the official languages, but we still want some official recognition for our role, our contribution to Canadian society. That argument, which I think is a very compelling one, was accepted by the B&B Commission. But the point is that those groups were not raising religious claims. The Ukrainians were not asking for, or the Italians or the Poles, were not making faith-based claims. They shared the same general Christian beliefs as the mainstream society. Multiculturalism has evolved over time and has gone beyond its initial origins amongst the white ethnic groups and has in many ways been taken over by newer groups who are visible minorities, who are non-European. But if we think about that shift which occurred throughout the 70s and 1980s towards a multiculturalism focused not on white ethnic groups, but on visible minority immigrants, for a long period of time, that too was not specifically about religious diversity. If you think about, which groups were really pushing for a focus on visible minorities, and the very term is an indication of this. It was the blacks from the Caribbean, who again are predominantly Christian and who are not making claims for religious accommodation. So both, if you think about the Ukrainians as being the initial demanders, or the Jamaicans who are pushing for anti-racism, neither of those moments in the 60s, 70s, or the 70s and 80s was religion a significant part of multiculturalism. It's really only in the 1990s, and primarily with the emergence of a kind of mobilized Muslim immigrant groups, that we've had a much greater, at least public awareness of and public debate about claims for accommodation on the basis of religious faith rather than ethnicity or race. And I think this is a natural progression, that just as it made sense for multiculturalism to move beyond white ethnicity to deal with race and anti-racism, it makes sense that it now moves beyond ethnicity and race to deal with religion. All of the arguments that exist for having multiculturalism in relation to ethnic groups and racial groups, I think also apply in the case of religious groups, but we don't yet have the same kind of institutional infrastructure for dealing with religious diversity. In the case of ethnic groups and racial groups, the federal government has helped to create the actors with whom they then negotiate. They helped to fund and create the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress. They helped to fund the Urban Race Alliance. They helped to, that's been part of the goal of the policy, is to encourage self-organization on an ethnic basis or a racial basis in order to enable people to participate and to discuss the issues that matter to them. We don't yet know what are the appropriate interlocutors on the issues of religious diversity. And there are deep disagreements about what kinds of faith-based claims are appropriate. I think we've relatively smoothly accepted the idea that there should be accommodations for religious holidays, for religious dress. Unlike, in France, there's no great movement to prevent Muslim girls from wearing headscarves or Sikh boys from wearing turbans. So on issues of dress and diet and religious holidays, that this shift to accepting faith-based claims has gone relatively smoothly. Things get much more controversial when we talk about the funding of religious education, whether there should be public funding for Jewish schools or Muslim schools or Hindu schools, or on issues about the role of religion in family law and the idea of faith-based arbitration. We had a big debate about that a few years ago. So I think what we're going through is a phase in which we have reasonably well settled and I think reasonably well-functioning multiculturalism programs in relation to ethnicity and race, and we're still working our way. We're still trying to figure out exactly how to fit religion into that framework. And that's in a way, it's a distinctively Canadian issue because most other countries didn't, as it were, have those earlier two stages of Canada and Australia, really the only two countries where multiculturalism was first demanded by European origin ethnic groups. And so we're trying to as it were, retrofit multiculturalism to deal with these emerging issues of politicized religion. A second issue, which I think is distinctly Canadian and that we need a lot of thinking to do, about, concerns the relationship between these three legs of the stool of diversity in Canada. In my view, it'll always be the case that we will think differently about Aboriginal issues than French-Canadian issues, than ethnic multiculturalism. So there's no reason to think that those three legs will endure. I think there's perfectly good reasons for us to deal in different ways with these three different types of groups. They have different kinds of needs, different kinds of histories, different kinds of aspirations. But it is important to think about how they interact and how to make sure that they don't work at cross purposes with each other, and how to make sure that support for one doesn't come at the expense of the other. And this was certainly part of what went on in the Quebec case, that many Quebec nationalists came to believe that multiculturalism for immigrants was in conflict with Quebec's struggle for autonomy and special status and a distinct society and so on. In my view, there's no inherent reason why we can't have a robust and generous form of multiculturalism for immigrants and a robust and generous form of accommodation of Quebec within Canada. I don't think there's any philosophical contradiction between those. And so too with Aboriginals. I don't think there's any logical contradiction between strong support for immigrant multiculturalism and strong support for Aboriginal land claims or treaty rights. And indeed, at the level of public opinion, these do go together. Those people who are most supportive of Aboriginal rights are also most supportive of bilingualism, are also most supportive of immigrant multiculturalism. So I think most people recognize that these are not contradictory projects. They're rooted in the same aspiration to try to create a more inclusive and just society. But it remains the case that we don't actually have much. There has never been much discussion in Canada about how exactly they relate to each other, and this is an issue both at the level of kind of theory about how we theorize the three different legs of the stool, but it's also increasingly an issue on the ground. So just to give an example, in many prairie cities, think about Regina or Winnipeg, you have neighborhoods in which you have poor Aboriginals living next door to poor immigrants. And under the current setup, the Aboriginals are dealt with under one set of laws, under one set of constitutional provisions relating to Aboriginal rights, and the immigrants are dealt with under another set of laws by a different government department. And that kind of made sense when the Aboriginals were living on reserves 300 miles away from Winnipeg or Regina. But for a variety of reasons, it's increasingly becoming the case that Aboriginals and immigrants they're in proximity, and public services, they're getting services from the same health care, from the same schools, police, and so on, and that on the ground, the idea that we can neatly separate Aboriginals from immigrants is not easy to sustain in contexts of increasing intermixing geographically. And a third issue, that's a distinctly Canadian issue. Lots of countries have issues of immigrant multiculturalism, but we have the distinctive task of figuring out how that relates to our older historic settlements with the Quebecois and with Aboriginals, and how to make sure that those fit together rather than conflicting with each other. And a third issue is about racism in Canada. And here, this part of the problem is, again, relating to the three stools. That if you look at the evidence, the multiculturalism policy to date largely operates on the assumption that racism in Canada is a matter of whites in relation to visible minorities. It's basically a white, non-white division. And that all the non-whites are sort of put into a single lump of visible minorities who are presumed to be the subjects of racism. And on the one hand, there's several problems with this. One is it leaves Aboriginals completely invisible. That Aboriginals are in fact the victims of very extensive forms of racism in various parts of the country. But they're often ignored by our anti-racism policies, which operate with the category of visible minority, understood as people of non-European origins who've come to Canada. So our anti-racism policies are under-inclusive because Aboriginals are left out, but they're also arguably over-inclusive, or at least insufficiently differentiated. And here some of my colleagues would disagree with me, but I think that if we look at what the statistics tell us about how Canadians view a variety of ethnic and racial groups, it's not at all the case that Canadians view blacks the same way they view Chinese, the same way they view Arabs. These are not all they're not all just put, they all face certain forms of discrimination, but they're very different forms of racism. Anti-black racism is very different from anti-Muslim racism, which is different again from anti-East Asian racism. And I actually think that this is that we need to get to the bottom of these different roots. I think these forms of racism have different roots historically and ideologically and geographically. And so I think our anti-racism programs aren't particularly effective because we don't have the right diagnosis of the roots of racism. But I also think it's a problem at the public policy level in our employment equity program. That Canada has an employment equity program that requires that companies that are regulated by the federal government meet certain, or at least try to meet certain thresholds of the employment of visible minorities. But it does not distinguish within the category of visible minorities. So it's entirely possible for, say, a chartered bank that's governed by the Employment Equity Act to go out and hire 50 Chinese Canadians and not have a single black on staff, and that would be in compliance with employment equity. And there are these kind of street rumors that's what the chartered banks did when employment equity was first brought in, is it went out and hired lots of East Asians in order to avoid having to hire blacks. This is different from the U.S., where blacks are a distinct category, in part in recognition of the very distinctive history and bases of anti-black racism. And my sense is that if we look at the trajectories for how different ethnic and racial groups in Canada are faring, we have inequality between white groups and non-white groups. That hasn't disappeared. But we also have growing inequality between different non-white groups. And we have no tools at the moment for dealing with those kinds of inequalities because they're all just lumped together under visible minorities. And so my hunch is that if we want to do better in achieving a just and inclusive society, we need to start disaggregating the category of visible minority and asking which groups within that big category are doing well, which ones are faring worst, which ones are subject to... So for example, one of the most disturbing facts in the Canadian case is that the one group, virtually all immigrant groups, the historic tendency has been that there's intergenerational mobility, that the children have higher levels of education than their parents, for example. It's a virtually universal law of immigrant integration. And that remains true for virtually all immigrant groups in Canada, including visible minority groups, but it's not true about Caribbean blacks. That we bring, many Caribbean blacks are educated and skilled. They're nurses, they're doctors, they're engineers. We recruit skilled people from the Caribbean. Their children are not maintaining the same level of educational credentials as their parents. That's a very disturbing finding. And it tells us there's something very specific going on in that context that I think we're just not grappling with, because we insist on viewing all of these issues through the simplified lens of white visible minority, rather than trying to unpack in a more sophisticated way the nature of racialization processes in Canada. Okay, so I think we have all of which is to say we have real problems in Canada. We're struggling to think through the place of religion in multiculturalism. We have deep and unresolved issues about the relationship between multiculturalism, Aboriginal rights, and the French fact, and we have, I think, a very crude and unsophisticated understanding of racism, which is leading. I think that the consequences of that are going to get more and more severe. That the problem of inequality between different visible minority groups is going to grow and grow in importance unless we figure out a way of dealing with it. So as I say, I hope no one will interpret what I've said today as grounds for complacency or the view that Canada's a utopia. I think we have deep and serious problems. But I just don't think we get any insight into those problems by thinking that we are reproducing the European pattern of sleepwalking into segregation. And that while we do have deep problems, I also think we have a lot of strength that we can build upon, that we have built up a body of experience, a body of institutions and practices based on this 40 years of experiment with multiculturalism that we can draw upon in dealing with the challenges of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, indeed. I hope now that you will have had an opportunity to let some of those thoughts process, they fit very nicely with our theme this year of good global citizenship. And of course, I think Canadians can resonate with our global nature when it comes to multiculturalism, because issues that happen in the rest of the world, for example, with Tamils in India or Sri Lanka, resonate here in Canada. And so we see those aspects in our everyday lives. And I hope that you'll begin to make your way to the outside microphones here and bring your questions to Dr. Kymlicka. And we'd like to hear from you. You know that we always invite dialogue here. And while you're doing that, I would like to ask a question myself, if you don't mind. Last year I was at the Metropolis Conference, and one of the issues that came up was related to intermarriage in Canada and how that's becoming a very significant aspect. And in my own mostly white family, I have a Jewish niece and I have Japanese nieces and nephews, and so it's becoming a very normal thing for families to be very integrated. And I wonder if you'd speak to that and how that ties in with some of the issues that you've already addressed.
Right. So I've been involved in so the federal government is interested in developing indicators of. I mean, we live in an era in which everything needs to be measured and ranked, and so the federal government wants to figure out what's the right set of indicators to judge whether we're doing well or badly on integration. And so there's been discussion about whether intermarriage rates should be one of the indicators, and I think sociologically, informally, I think it's a very good indicator that if people are comfortable with diversity, if they're comfortable with people of different races and religions and ethnicity as neighbors, in the workplace, you would just predict statistically that people are going to fall in love with each other and there's going to be higher rates of intermarriage. And if we don't see that, that's evidence that there's something to worry about. On the other hand, we obviously cannot have the government saying that intermarriage is preferable to endogamy. That would be. I mean, there are groups who have religious and other reasons for wanting to marry within the group, who believe they may have a religious obligation to do so. I don't think we can have as an explicit public policy that we want to maximize or increase the level of intermarriage. But it is statistic. I mean, I think it's my recommendation to the government was don't. It shouldn't be on the list of formal indicators of success, but I think it's certainly worth having research on levels of intermarriage, and where we don't see growing levels of intermarriage, to ask whether that's the result of genuinely voluntary choice, that people say they have a religious obligation to marry within the group, in which case it's fine, or whether it's because they are living in isolated, they're kind of involuntarily segregated, isolated, such that they're simply not interacting in comfortable settings with people such that they come to form interethnic friendships, romances, marriages, and so on. And my sense is that if we look at, there are growing rates of intermarriage across all ethnic and racial groups, and that those groups that have lower rates of intermarriage are not, generally speaking, the poorest or the most segregated or the most isolated. It is instead groups who, for their own cultural or religious reasons, still have a strong preference for marrying within the group.
Hi. I wonder if you could comment on a situation that has arose locally on the ground, and it relates to one of the challenges that you mentioned, which is multiculturalism as it relates to religion. Recently, our public school board approved a request from the Gideon Bible Society to send letters home to parents offering a copy of the Bible, and agreed to distribute them through the school. So I'm wondering what comment you might have on that from a multicultural point of view.
I had not heard that. That's very interesting. And the board agreed?
Yes.
So the board agreed that the Gideon Society could hand out letters to, or
send out letters to parents offering a Bible to their child if they so desired, and distribution through the school. That's my understanding of it.
Well, that sounds bizarre to me, but I would want to find out more before I don't think it's the I don't think it's the function of the public schools to serve as instruments for religious proselytization. So I mean, unless there's something more to the story, if I had been on the board, I think I would have voted no. And if the Gideon Society said that there was something in the multiculturalism policy that required boards to do this, that I think is just a misreading of the policy. There's nothing in the policy that suggests that religious groups have a right to use public schools as means for proselytization. So it's not a very helpful answer, but I just don't know the details. But
well, I would think the issue would be the flip side, which would be non-Christian, or not just non-Christians, anyone who objects to religious material being distributed by a public institution.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to push you a little bit further on this notion of the mistake of lumping all of the visible minorities together as other.
Yeah.
And I was thinking as I listened to you about the tensions that exist between them. Yeah. When we talk about the virtues of toleration and so forth, very little attention is paid to the racism, if we can be blunt about it, that exists from A to B to C, maybe from Chinese to Middle Eastern, or from or toward Muslims, or towards Caribbeans, what have you. We saw some example of that in a recent case in Toronto involving Chinese shopkeepers and a shoplifter who was of another ethnicity. But what I don't see in the institutions that are trying to promote toleration and understanding is a lot of people moving across boundaries from one thing to another. When you have a heritage language program for Ukrainian language, it's Ukrainians who take it, or it's Chinese who take the Mandarin class. You don't see people wanting to cross that barrier and learn about somebody else in a really deep and intense kind of way. Yeah. Would you agree?
Yes and no. I agree. Yes to the first half, no to the second. On the first question, I agree entirely that, immigrants and their children and visible minorities are an increasing percentage of Canadian society, and so their attitudes of tolerance and respect are vital for the future of the Canadian multicultural experiment. And if visible minorities maintain prejudiced attitudes towards other minority groups, then that's as much that is going to be. If the Chinese in Vancouver are strongly prejudiced against blacks or Latin Americans or Aboriginals, then that's going to be as much of a barrier to the integration of those groups as if whites do, because in many parts of Vancouver there's more Chinese than whites, and they're the ones who are increasingly have the levers of who gets jobs and who gets So and there is evidence that I absolutely agree that Europeans created a race war by engaging in colonialism around the world, and so there is a form of white supremacist racism that is historically unrivaled in its scope and its depth and the brutalities that it's inflicted on people. But it's not the only form of racism that has existed in the world. And there are lots of other cultures that have historically had their own ideas of racial and ethnic hierarchy, and in some cases they've brought those prejudices with them. And in other cases, those prejudices have been okay. And so if we look at some of the evidence about, say, prejudice against Aboriginals, it actually is that, for example, the Chinese are more prejudiced against Aboriginals than white Canadians. so there is significant levels of prejudice against blacks, against Aboriginals, against Muslims, amongst other visible minority groups. And if we don't deal with that effectively, we're closing our eyes to a very serious and potentially growing problem. Having said that, so I agree that our anti-racism strategies are going to fail completely if they're just aimed at, if they operate on the picture that it's white people are prejudiced and visible minorities are not. We're missing huge parts of a very complicated social reality. Having said that, many people argue that the reason why the Chinese, for example, because they're not the only one, express prejudice against Aboriginals and blacks is that they're trying to act white. They're trying to prove their credentials as whites by distancing themselves from what they perceive to be the stigmatized groups, by distancing themselves from those groups that are already stigmatized by the larger society. And so this is not really, or not solely, a matter of them bringing prejudices with them. They come here, they see that these are stigmatized groups in our society. In order to make sure that they aren't stigmatized, they act white. They affiliate themselves with the whites by expressing prejudice against. So, I think there is some truth to that, because, as I said, white supremacist racism has historically been so powerful and global in its scope that I think it continues to play a deeper role. So it would be disavowing our responsibility to say, well, the problem with racism in Vancouver today is that the Chinese are racist. It's not white racism. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but those are the complications we need to deal with. Okay, that's the first part of your question. The second one was about we don't see much interaction across groups. So firstly, there's a question about the multiculturalism policy. There was a time in the very early 1970s when multiculturalism primarily funded mono-ethnic activities. It funded Ukrainians doing folk dances to a Ukrainian audience. That ended by the late 1970s. That model of multicultural programming really is long gone. Since the 1980s, the vast bulk of multicultural funding requires that you be engaged in inter-ethnic activities. It funds collaborations between different ethnic groups. It funds genuinely multicultural activities. That you do have to show that you're creating contact across ethnic groups, and so I think the government has recognized that it's not enough to just fund activities that are solely contained within one ethnic group. We want to encourage contact. So I think that lesson has been learned and integrated into the program funding. But I also think it's true generally, leaving aside the technicalities of the multiculturalism programming, that Canadians wish to engage in interethnic contact. I don't see evidence that groups are retreating, hunkering down into their own ethnic group. It's certainly true if you ask people that they want to live they want their children to be meeting people from other ethnic groups. And as I said, the evidence is growing levels of comfort with having people of different ethnic and racial origins as neighbors, as co-workers, or having someone in one family marry someone from another group. And that is particularly true of the younger generation. There's some very interesting data that looks at people under 25. We have the Canada Youth Survey. And, if one wants hope for the future, one should look at some of the studies of the attitudes of young Canadians. They have a level of comfort with diversity that is just... the age differentials, if you compare these... the over 65s with the over 45s with the over 25s, and then the younger Canadians, the comfort with and desire for and levels of interaction across ethnic lines are really quite staggering at the younger levels.
Hello. I've been following recently the issues in the media surrounding this new citizenship guide that's being created for the immigrant populations, and I'm just curious to get your reaction in terms of how you see that affecting the multicultural model, if at all.
Right. So I was marginally, peripherally involved in some of the discussions around the revision of the Citizenship Guide. I don't know whether anyone saw the old one. It was really awful. It was truly, mindless. I'm no fan of the Conservative government. I don't trust their intentions. But the old guide needed revision. It did not provide people with relevant, helpful information about the country that they are becoming a member of. And what I and many others said, that one of the things immigrants need to know is our historic struggles within Canada. Immigrants need to know that there are lots of people in Quebec who are not happy about being in Canada. It's amazing that the old Citizenship Guide said nothing about Quebec nationalism. And that people need to know that Aboriginals are pretty pissed off. That you wouldn't have known that from the old Citizenship Guide. So, and in order to understand those facts, you need to know some of the history about why Aboriginals in the Quebecois might not be so happy with. And the media just the media reported this as all forms of. The new guide adds a lot of history, including history of struggle, contestation, conflict. What got reported in the media was almost exclusively the fact that the guide adds stuff about the history of our participation in the war. And this was presented as evidence of the Conservative government's trying to present a militaristic vision of Canada as opposed to the liberal peacekeeping model of Canada. There's a bit of that, and it's not. I wouldn't have made that choice. Although, again, to be fair, it was crazy that the old guide said nothing about Canada's participation in the two world wars, which have had a huge influence on Canadian society, and we need to. So I think in general, the way in which the new Citizenship Guide, it is. I believe it's better, and that the way in which it's brought in history is generally responsible, more or less accurate. I wouldn't have always agreed with all the emphasis, but one thing, it's just a much better guide. And it doesn't disavow multiculturalism. It doesn't disavow bilingualism. If one wanted evidence that the Citizenship Guide is pushing a socially conservative agenda, I actually don't think it's the military part, which, as I say, most of what it says, it doesn't say that much about military history, and most of what it says is just common sense, that it was important that Canada participated in the world wars. What I think is evidence of social conservatism is the way it talks about gender equality but says nothing about sexual orientation. So in Canada, under the Human Rights Act and by judgments of the Supreme Court, we have guarantees against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And Canada is quite strong on an international comparative perspective in its defense of gay rights, including gay marriage, of course. The guide says nothing whatsoever about sexual orientation. Why? Because conservative backbenchers are not happy about the fact that we've moved in the direction of gay rights. It does talk about gender equality. Why? Because the way in which it talks about, which, there's some conservative backbenchers who aren't so keen about gender equality either, but it's presented in the form, we're going to protect our core value of gender equality against immigrants. It's not exactly that the way it's worded, but that when immigrants come, they have to accept our core values, such as gender equality. And so which is a way of kind of saying to us, potentially, to its constituency, don't worry, we're not going to let immigrants change us too much. And one of the examples they give is gender equality. But so from my point of view, when immigrants come to Canada, one of the most distinctive aspects of changing Canadian society over the last 20, 30 years is our change in attitudes towards sexual orientation. And it's very important that immigrants know that we have strong laws against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and that we now have gay marriage, and it's protected by the Constitution, blah, 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 blah. And I would have included that along with gender equality as part of our broader human rights commitments. But for, I think, kind of basically socially conservative reasons, it's completely silent on the sexual orientation part.
Hi. You mentioned the debate that we had in Ontario about faith-based arbitration and family law, and I'm wondering how you assess the outcome of that debate. Did the McGuinty government handle it correctly? And in terms of this need that you've identified to grapple with religious diversity, did the handling of that debate in 2006 move us one step forward or two steps back?
Yeah. So, how much time do we have? I have... Here again, I thought the media did an absolutely terrible job in explaining to people in Ontario what the issue was. So just let me spend a moment, if I can, on giving you my account of what the issue was. The Arbitration Act in Ontario allowed people to choose to go to a private arbitrator for a range of disputes. They could be commercial disputes, they could be family law disputes. And to choose what the law would be that would be used by the private adjudicator. This was a right that was given to all Ontario citizens to be able to go to choose private arbitration on a range of possible legal disputes. And this is part of a much broader trend across Western democracies to allow for alternative dispute resolution. Our courts are massively overbooked, they're very slow, they're very expensive. People need to find alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. This is a trend across the Western democracies. It has nothing in particular to do with Muslims. It has nothing in particular to do with family law. It's a general trend towards creating more possibility for private arbitration. And that's the law under which Jewish groups, Ismaili groups, Sunni groups, and others offered a private arbitration that would be governed by certain faith-based principles, which was what the law allowed for. So the law did not single out religion. It wasn't a law on the possibility of religious arbitration. It was a law on the possibility of private arbitration, and it was up to people to consent whether they wanted to have what kind of arbitrator using what kind of law. So it was not a privilege given to Muslims. It did not involve the government giving legitimacy to Sharia law. It didn't involve the government saying this kind of Sharia law is good and that's bad. It was just giving individuals the right to consensually agree to private arbitration on a range of disputes. Okay, and of which faith-based arbitration was one of a variety of alternatives that people had the right to under the Arbitration Act. Now, I think that there was a problem with that, which is that there wasn't adequate safeguards for the training of the private arbitrators. There wasn't adequate safeguards of ensuring that consent was genuine and informed, and that there wasn't adequate safeguards for the appeal of the decisions. But that's true of all forms of private arbitration. It's nothing specific to religious arbitration. That's true about any form of alternative dispute resolution. Once you take it out of the public courts, that's the price we pay for private arbitration. The public courts are transparent, they're accountable, they have very firm protections, but they're very slow, very expensive. Private arbitration is cheaper and quicker, but it's riskier. It creates the risk that the consent is not truly genuine, that the decisions are not properly informed, that the arbitrators are not properly trained, that the decisions are not properly reviewed. So the Boyd report, I thought, was an eminently sensible report. The Boyd report said private arbitration is good. Alternative dispute resolution in general is a good trend, but let's build the safeguards. Okay. So we could have had that. So what we should have had is an intelligent discussion about how to have effective forms of private arbitration that protect the rights, particularly of vulnerable parties. Because it's the vulnerable group that tends to have its consent not properly informed, or its decisions that are adverse to their interests properly reviewed, and so on. Okay, so so what we should have had is a debate about how to build safe and effective forms of private arbitration. What instead we had this ridiculous debate about whether the government should be endorsing Sharia law, which it was a complete misunderstanding of what the real issue was. I don't blame the McGuinty government for making that mistake. I think that mistake was it's a mistake that was promoted by some of the critics so many of the people who mobilized against faith-based arbitration, I think, quite deliberately distorted what the real issue was. I think the media played a role in going along with that distortion. And the result is, I think that we still do not have, we still do not, it's unresolved. How do we make space for private arbitration in family issues, but also in commercial issues, in a wide range of disputes, in ways that protect vulnerable parties while still being quicker and more accessible than the courts. So I think that what happened at the end was I think it was the wrong decision. It was premature. It was based on a misreading of what the real issue is, and it's unresolved. It's going to come back. This issue is not dead. But on the other hand, I don't think, and I do. Obviously, it's evidence of a kind of Islamophobia, because the courts have been going on for Jews and for various Christian groups for a long time. It's only when the Muslims demanded it that we got this big brouhaha, and that's obviously forms of inconsistency and double standards and so on. But on the other hand, if one wanted to try to find a silver lining in the story, I think it did help bring out the multiple voices within the Muslim community. It actually encouraged a lot of people to get involved on the issue on different sides, and helped. So in other words, I think this is a kind of inevitable growing pains, that because we don't yet have these well-developed systems for integrating religion into our multiculturalism programming and frameworks, we're going to go through phases like this, where because the government didn't know who to talk to, it didn't know who were the relevant actors, spokespeople, but I think next time that issue comes up, we will, I hope, have a more intelligent debate.
Two more questions here and here.
I was wondering if you could address the impact of the current economic downturn on the implementation of the multicultural policy. And I guess the thought I'm having is, if there isn't government funding, how sustainable are the programs? And where will we go in the long run if we simply can't afford some of these bridges that are created with the multicultural policy?
Right. So the first thing to say is that the multiculturalism policy at the federal level is roughly $15 to $20 million, which is peanuts by federal government budgetary standards. And I actually think we shouldn't obsess too much about what goes on in that particular funding envelope. That I think a lot of the real action in multiculturalism has been picked up by a much broader range of actors. Provincial governments, municipal governments, the City of Toronto doing some very interesting things in multiculturalism, hospitals, police forces. The federal government got the ball rolling, but that ball has been picked up by a very wide range of actors. And many of the things they do are not first and foremost, everything costs money, but it's not, the commitment to proactively think about whether the rules and regulations and practices and symbols and schedules and holidays and so on of one's workplace or one's institution, to ask whether they are truly reducing barriers to participation, whether they're creating a welcoming and inclusive environment, whether they accord recognition to diversity. A lot of these things are not actually terribly expensive. It's not like buying a multi-million-dollar CAT scan equipment or something. And so I actually think in a way that the multiculturalism program is less vulnerable to economic funding cuts. Its success is less. It's not so directly dependent on exactly how many dollars are invested in it. It really does depend on a kind of moral and political commitment to the goals, and it's more about how you spend the resources you have rather than having to get a whole bunch of more resources. And so long as people remain, the people both grassroots mobilization and elites, so long as they remain committed to the goals, I think we can survive some cuts in funding. On a related question, I don't think that it's. I mean, this may be a slight digression, but lots of people think that attitudes towards minorities and towards immigrants are fundamentally driven by economic considerations. This is a different question from what you were asking, but such that when things go badly, people become more racist or more xenophobic or more hostile to diversity. I actually think that's a mistake, and that if we look at what's going on, and so, for example, there's some very interesting survey data that asks, would you rather have large numbers of immigrants who are going to contribute to the economy, or a smaller number of immigrants, much smaller number of immigrants who are going to live on welfare? In most European countries, they'd prefer the smaller number of people who live on welfare than large numbers of immigrants who will contribute to the economy. The main resistance to immigration is perception of cultural threat, not economic threat, at least in many contexts. And that's why I go back to that finding about the fact that in Canada, people who are proud of their country do not feel threatened by immigration. That's an important and striking finding. I mean, that in a way is a central task: how to make sure that people don't feel culturally threatened by diversity and otherness and immigration. And I think that's more of an ongoing challenge than the ebbs and flows of economic.
Given in your studies of multiculturalism, did you find differences in how Canadians viewed people coming to Canada as refugees and people coming to Canada as immigrants in other situations? And secondly, given our current government's desire to limit the number of refugee claimants, do you think that if it continues might begin to influence how people see immigration and multiculturalism in general?
Right. So we do not. I think most Canadians don't, in fact, distinguish refugees from immigrants. I mean, we know legally there's a difference in how they arrive, but it's part of the structure of Canadian policy that if you're accepted as a bona fide refugee, you basically move into the immigrant track. That beyond that initial determination of whether you're a refugee or not, that refugees in Canada have the same right to gain citizenship as immigrants. That's not true in all countries. In some countries, refugees only gain the right to temporary asylum and are expected to return once their country of origin is safe. When they no longer have a well-grounded fear of persecution, they should go home. In Canada, if you have a bona fide claim to being a refugee, you have the right to stay permanently. Even if your country then miraculously becomes safe, you're not expected or asked to go home. So the structure of Canadian policy is intended to kind of merge refugees and immigrants such that within 3 years they all have the right to become citizens, and I don't think Canadians distinguish them after that point. What I think Canadians do, one thing that I think is very important to take into account is that Canadians, like in every other country, do not want to be faced with large-scale influx of uninvited, unwanted migrants, whether they're illegal economic migrants or potential refugees. So and I think we've seen this again with the boatload showing up on the West Coast, that in many Western countries, think about the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, or you think about Italy or Spain or Greece, they have boatloads of hundreds of people literally washing up on their shores uninvited, and that creates a very strong backlash. And I think it would in Canada as well. That if we had, on a weekly basis, boatloads with hundreds of Chinese showing up on the West Coast, it would create a moral panic and a very strong anti-immigrant, anti-multiculturalism backlash. And we saw little moments of this. I don't know if you remember, there were back in the 80s, there were a boatload of Sri Lankans that showed up on the East Coast, and then there was the 4 boatloads of Chinese showing up in the West Coast. And each time there was this remarkable sense of emergency. In fact, in the original case, Brian Mulroney recalled Parliament, calling it a national emergency, that there was a boatload of Sri Lankans on the East Coast. And so that I think it's very important. So this is a long way of saying, I think it's very important that Canadians have a sense of kind of control over our borders. And it's just geographic good luck. It's very hard to get to Canada, except through, I mean, we only have one land border with the U.S., and anyone who gets to the U.S. wants to stay there. Very, very few of them want to come to Canada. So, and on the contrary, most people, many migrants who come to Canada hope eventually to move to the U.S. My father was one of those. So, so we're not worried about a massive influx of people across the U.S. border. That's never going to happen. And there is no prospect of a massive influx of people by any other land border, because we don't have any other land border. We can't get a massive influx of people by airplane because you need a visa to get on a plane to come to Canada, and it's expensive. So the only possibility is if we suddenly had hundreds of, these boatloads of people, which is very difficult to arrange. But even when we just have the beginning sliver of the possibility of large-scale unwanted influx of people who might claim refugee status, people go crazy, right? Which I think shows, parenthetically, that it's a mistake to think that Canadians are somehow genetically tolerant, or I think we have built a reasonably decent and inclusive society, but I do think it depends very much on the belief that we're in control of who we let in. And that depends, that's very much just a fact about geography and borders and so on. And if we were confronted with large-scale influx of unwanted, uninvited refugee claimants, we would probably turn out to be as illiberal and xenophobic as anyone else.
Thank you very much for tonight's interesting and intellectually stimulating lecture. I'm sure that you understand already that multiculturalism is one of those things that in Canada is interwoven into every aspect of who we are, both as a nation and into the very social fabric of who we are as individuals in a society. And it's essential to begin to have so many of these discussions, but we see that these discussions bleed into other areas. And so it's very wonderful that we could have you with us this evening talking about these issues, especially when our theme is related to good global citizenship and what that means, because I think everyone here wants to be a good global citizen. So I thank you again, Dr. Kymlicka, for your presence tonight, for your questions and answers that you've given us. I thank you all as well for coming and making this evening what it was. We appreciate your support both physically and financially to continue these lectures. So it's my pleasure to see you all here. I want to remind you that our next series is a mini course with Dr. Peter Erb, who's one of our locally renowned eminent speakers, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that. It's about notes for the modern skeptic and the place of the church in the modern world. So that will be in January. Until that time, I'm wishing you all a very peaceful and safe holiday season. Thank you.